There's a dress hanging in a glass case in Magnolia Creek, Georgia, and if you ask anybody in town about it, they'll get quiet before they answer. It's blue. Not fancy blue. The blue of a Tuesday evening sky, stitched by hand under a bare kitchen bulb, with thread that cost $4 and a whole lot of pride. Some folks say it was made to survive a joke. Others say it was made to end one. What almost nobody knows is what happened in the 3 weeks before that dress ever saw the Callaway mansion: the doubt, the test, the silence, and the moment a grown woman realized she'd almost thrown away the realest thing that ever walked into her life. This is the story of a rich woman's cruel invitation, a maid who refused to shrink, and a mechanic who never once raised his voice to prove he was good. Stay with me. Odessa Mae Freeman kept her life small on purpose. 29, she rose at 5:15 every morning in her rented house on Pecan Street, put coffee on before she looked in the mirror, and drove her 10-year-old Corolla 11 miles out to the Callaway estate, where she'd worked as a housekeeper for 6 years. She knew how the Callaways liked their linens folded, which face Mrs. Callaway wanted the peonies in. She was good at her job, proud of being good at it. What she wasn't proud of, what she kept folded up tight the way she folded those linens, was the 2 men who'd come before and left her smaller than they found her. The first was Reggie, her high school sweetheart, who she'd put through 2 years of community college on her own paycheck while he told her he was building toward something. What he was building was a second relationship with a girl from the tire plant, one he'd been seeing 8 of those months. Odessa found out from a cousin at a cookout, not from Reggie. He never apologized proper. The second was Darnell, older, smoother, a man who complimented her cooking and her patience in the same breath he used to borrow money he never paid back. When she added it up, near $3,000 over a year and a half, he called her ungrateful for asking. She cut him loose, and something in her cut loose right along with him. Not her strength. Her willingness. Since then, Odessa had built a life that required nothing from anybody. She read at night instead of dating. She had sewed since her grandmother taught her at 9, because a needle and thread never once lied to her or asked for gas money. Her house was small and entirely hers, and she would have told you she was happy. What she wouldn't have told you, because she barely let herself think it, was how long it had been since she'd let anybody see her cry, how she measured men now by how fast she could picture them leaving, and how there were nights she sat on her porch step with tea going cold in her hands, aching for something she'd convinced herself she no longer wanted. Marcus Whitfield had grease under his fingernails that Sunday soap couldn't fully get out, and he'd stopped apologizing for it years ago. 32, raised by his grandmother off Route 9 after his mother passed when he was 11, Marcus learned early that dignity wasn't handed to you, it was built, one honest day at a time. He ran Whitfield Auto Repair out of a converted barn, the same shop his grandfather started, and he still drove Miss Dolores Whitfield to her Wednesday prayer meeting every week, rain or shine, because she'd raised him and a man paid his debts, even the ones nobody else was tracking. He wasn't rich, and he'd made peace with that. What he had instead was a reputation nobody in Magnolia Creek could touch. He fixed old Mr. Tibbet's truck for free the winter Tibbet lost his wife, because grief didn't need an invoice on top of it. He coached Pee-wee football on Saturday mornings for nothing but gas money and the sound of 8-year-olds calling him Coach Marcus. He tithed before he paid himself, every week, especially the tight ones, because that was when it mattered most. Small things. Consistent things. The kind that don't make headlines but make a man. He wasn't unfamiliar with rich spaces, he serviced half the fancy cars in the county, but he always felt the difference the second he stepped into one. Conversations paused a half beat too long. People's eyes dropped to his hands before they met his face. He didn't perform humility in those rooms, and he didn't perform anger either. He just stood up straight, said what needed saying, and left when his business was done. His grandmother taught him that, you don't have to shrink to be respectful, and you don't have to get loud to be respected. They met on a Tuesday in March, at the Callaway estate, though not because either of them had planned it. Odessa was hauling a bag of trash to the curb when Marcus pulled up in his tow truck to collect Mrs. Callaway's Mercedes for its oil change. He offered to carry the bag the rest of the way without making a thing of it, and she let him, mostly because arguing about a trash bag felt like more trouble than it was worth. While he waited on Mrs. Callaway to bring out the keys, he noticed the little herb garden Odessa kept along the side fence, basil, time, a stubborn row of mint that had outgrown its bed, and asked, with real curiosity, whether the mint was fighting everybody else for root space. It was such a specific, correct question that she laughed before she caught herself. They talked for 11 minutes about dirt and roots and how mint would take over the whole world if you let it, and somewhere in there Marcus mentioned his grandmother's garden, how she still put up preserves every August the same way she had for 50 years. Odessa mentioned, almost without meaning to, that she sewed, that she'd made her own church dresses since she was a teenager because store-bought never fit her the way she wanted. Marcus didn't say anything slick about that. He just nodded and said that sounded like a real skill, not a hobby, and something about the way he said it, plain, unimpressed with himself, genuinely interested in her, snagged in Odessa's chest. Mrs. Calloway came out with the keys before either of them said much else, and Marcus left with the car and a phone number he hadn't asked for, tucked into his shirt pocket because Odessa had decided, for reasons she couldn't fully explain to herself that night, to slip it into his hand before she could talk herself out of it. He texted 2 days later, not that night, not the next morning, 2 days, like a man who wasn't trying to seem eager or unavailable, just steady. "What are you making this week?" he asked, and it became a running thing between them. She'd send him a photo of fabric laid out on her kitchen table, he'd guess, always wrong, always game to guess again. He started stopping by Pecan Street on Thursday evenings after the shop closed, never empty-handed, a bag of boiled peanuts one week, a jar of his grandmother's fig preserves the next, and never staying past 9, never pushing to stay later, never once making her feel like his patience had a price tag on it. She noticed the specific shape of his consistency before she noticed anything else. He asked about her day and then actually listened to the answer. He remembered she didn't like her tea too sweet and started bringing his own sugar packets instead of assuming hers. When her car battery died in February, he drove out at 10 at night, jumped it, refused gas money, and left before she could even offer him coffee, like helping her wasn't a transaction he was keeping a ledger on. Slowly, without deciding to, she started telling him small true things. That she was tired sometimes of being the strong one. That she missed her grandmother something fierce in the spring, when the garden came back but her grandmother didn't. He never rushed those moments. He just sat with them, quiet, present, like her sadness didn't scare him off the way it had scared off other men. "Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because I think you already know the answer. Have you ever tested someone you loved, not on purpose, but tested them anyway, because somebody who hurt you taught you love has to be earned twice before you can trust it once? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and you're not the only person carrying that. It happened on an ordinary Sunday, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a turning point. Bethany Calloway, the family's only daughter, 26, and recently back from a broken engagement in Atlanta, stopped Odessa in the kitchen with an envelope and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're coming to my birthday party," she said, more instruction than invitation. Odessa later learned, from a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, that it wasn't kindness behind it. Bethany had told her college friends, laughing over mimosas, that it would be hilarious to see how the help would dress up for a real party, a joke dressed in an envelope, meant to be unwrapped in front of a room full of people. Something about it lodged sideways in Odessa's chest and didn't stay there alone. It sat right next to Reggie's silence and Darnell's excuses, and by Thursday, when Marcus showed up with his same easy smile, she found herself watching him differently. Would he be embarrassed by her at something like that party? Would he disappear the way people did when the cost of being seen with her got too high? She hated the question even as she asked it, and hated more that she couldn't stop. She started noticing things she'd overlooked, how he'd go quiet in rich spaces, how careful he was with his words around money. She told herself she was being observant. Really, she was building a case, the way a person braces for a blow they've already decided is coming. She decided to test him, hating herself a little even as she planned it. 3 days before the party, she called Marcus and told him, voice flat, that she wasn't going. Told him it was beneath her, a setup she didn't need to walk into. What she didn't tell him was that she needed to see what he'd do next, whether he'd let it drop, relieved to skip an awkward night among people who'd look at his hands before his face. Marcus didn't try to talk her out of it that first call. He just asked one question. "You want to go?" And when she admitted to quiet, almost angry at her own honesty, that some stubborn part of her did want to go, want to prove something, he said, "Then go." And I'll be standing next to you the whole night if you'll let me. The night of the party, the Callaway lawn was strung with white lights and the air smelled like magnolia and money. Odessa stood on her porch in the dress she'd finished at 2 that morning, blue silk cotton she'd found on clearance and stitched herself over 11 nights, using the silver thimble her grandmother had pressed into her hand the summer before she died. She almost didn't go. Her hand was on the doorknob, then off it, then on it again. Marcus's truck pulled up right on time. He didn't honk. He walked up the porch steps in the one good suit he owned, pressed himself that morning with an iron and a YouTube tutorial, and when she opened the door, he didn't say anything about the dress right away. He just looked at her a long moment, the kind of look that isn't performance, and said, low and certain, "You ready?" Not "you look beautiful," though his eyes said that plenty. "You ready?" Like he already knew she could do this and just needed to hear it decided out loud. They walked into that party together, and the room did what rooms like that do, went quiet, then buzzed, phones lifting halfway before lowering, Bethany's mouth falling open at the dress she never imagined the help could produce. Marcus never flinched under the stares. He got Odessa a drink, found her a seat near the terrace edge where she could breathe, and when Bethany's friend made a snide comment about borrowed dresses, Marcus said nothing cutting, nothing loud. He simply said, "She made that dress herself. With her own 2 hands. That's not something money can buy," and turned back to Odessa like the conversation was already over, because to him, it was. That was the test, though he never knew it. Every choice he made that night, staying by her side, refusing to be embarrassed, defending her without ever raising his voice, he made without an audience in mind. He made them because that was simply who he was when nobody was grading him for it. The trouble started 2 days later, with a photograph. Bethany posted a picture from the terrace, Odessa's dress catching the light, Marcus's hand at her back captioned with something Odessa read as mocking, though she'd later learn it wasn't. Underneath, one of Bethany's friends had written something crude about the help finding herself a man with a truck, tagging Marcus's shop. Odessa saw it at 11 that night, alone, phone light the only thing on in her dark kitchen, and every old wound she'd stitched shut tore open at once. She didn't call him or ask if he'd seen it. Instead, she did what she'd trained herself to do since Reggie, since Darnell. She went quiet. She let his next 3 texts sit unread for a full day, then answered the 4th with a single word, "busy." When he showed up Thursday out of habit, she didn't open the door until he'd rung twice, keeping the chain latched, talking through a 3-inch gap like he was a stranger selling something. She told herself she was protecting herself, that this was just what always happened. What she didn't tell herself, because she couldn't bear to, was that she was doing the leaving before he could, punishing him for a comment he hadn't even written. 4 days of silence went by. Marcus stopped texting on the 3rd day, not out of anger, but because he could tell pushing wasn't going to open that chain door, only time might. Odessa spent those 4 days rehearsing the speech she'd give him if he ever asked why, a speech about self-protection and pattern recognition, a speech that sounded reasonable every time she practiced it alone and felt hollow every single time. The reveal came from an unlikely place. Miss Dolores, who ran into Odessa at the Piggly Wiggly and, unaware any wall had gone up, mentioned how proud she was of her grandson for going back to that comment thread himself. Odessa's stomach dropped. Dolores explained, gently, unaware she was delivering the exact information that would break Odessa open. Marcus hadn't just seen the comment. He'd called Bethany's friend directly, calm and unshaken, and told her plainly that talking about Odessa that way wasn't something he'd let stand, whether he was there to hear it or not. He hadn't done it for credit. He hadn't even told Odessa, because to him it wasn't a favor, it was simply the only decent thing to do. Odessa stood in the cereal aisle, hand pressed flat against her chest, breath caught between her ribs, and felt the full shape of what she'd done. He hadn't disappeared. He hadn't shrunk from the ugliness. He'd stood in it, quietly, on her behalf, asking for no recognition, and she had answered with a chained door and 4 days of silence. Her hands were shaking by the time she got to her car. She sat in the lot alone while before trusting herself to drive, replaying every unread text, every wall she'd built against a man who'd never once given her a real reason to build it. She drove straight to the shop that afternoon, bay doors open to the heat, radio playing low. Marcus came out wiping his hands on a rag, and for a second neither said anything, just stood in the gravel lot with 4 days of silence between them. I heard what you did, Odessa finally said, voice unsteady. With Bethany's friend. Your grandmother told me. Marcus set the rag down slow. Wasn't trying to keep it from you. Just wasn't looking for credit for doing what any decent person should do. I shut the door on you, she said, and it came out cracked. I saw one ugly comment and I decided you'd already left before you even had the chance to prove you wouldn't. That's not fair to you. That was never about you. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke, there was no anger in it, just something tired and honest. I know it wasn't. I could feel it wasn't, even when it didn't feel good. But I need you to hear this too. I'm not asking to be tested every time something scares you. I've spent my whole life in rooms where people decided who I was before I opened my mouth. I thought maybe with you, I wouldn't have to keep proving it every single week. You're right, Odessa said, and she let herself cry then, right there in the gravel lot, no performance to it, just relief and shame tangled together. I built a wall out of every man who let me down before you, and I made you stand on the wrong side of it. That's on me. Not on you. I'm not Reggie, Marcus said quietly. Not Darnell either. I know you know that in your head. I need you to let your heart catch up. He reached out slow, giving her every chance to step back, and when she didn't, he pulled her into a hug that smelled like motor oil and ivory soap, and something in Odessa's chest that had been clenched for 6 years finally let go. It wasn't fixed in that one hug, they both knew that, but it was real, and a start neither was willing to walk away from. Miss Dolores had raised one grandson and buried one daughter, and she didn't hand out trust for decoration. 2 Sundays later, when Marcus brought Odessa to dinner, Dolores set the fried chicken down, sat across from her, and asked plainly, "What do you want with my grandson, baby? Speak straight, now. I've heard fast talk before and it don't move me." Odessa didn't reach for anything polished. "I want to stop being scared of good things, Miss Dolores. Marcus is the first man who's made me believe that's possible." Dolores studied her a long moment, the kind of look that likely unsettled grown men twice Odessa's size, then nodded once, slow. "All right then," she said, passing the collard greens like the matter was settled, because to her, it was. She'd watched Odessa's hands the whole meal, the way she cleared plates unasked, the way she looked at Marcus when he wasn't looking back. Trust, for Dolores, was never about a speech. It was about what a person did when nobody was grading them. There was a second gatekeeper nobody expected, Bethany herself, who showed up at the shop a week later, stiff among the tire stacks, to apologize. Not for the party, she admitted, cheeks red. For what came after, and the joke that started it. Marcus accepted it plainly, no theatrics, and told her the same thing he'd told her friend: people deserved respect whether they were in the room or not. Bethany left quieter than she'd come, and something about it told Odessa that even people who'd hurt her weren't always beyond changing. Odessa told him the whole truth on the porch that week, no edges hidden. "The night I called you before the party, saying I wasn't going, that wasn't about the party. I was testing you. I wanted to see if you'd let me off the hook, be relieved not to be seen with me somewhere it mattered. I needed to know before I let myself want you the way I already did." Marcus took that in slow, no flash of hurt crossing his face. "Figured something like that," he admitted. "Wasn't mad, once I understood it. A woman who's been lied to as many times as you have, testing somebody isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. I just needed you to know you didn't have to keep testing me forever." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a handkerchief, her grandmother's thimble, lost in the grass near the terrace that night. He'd found it, kept it safe, waiting for the right time. "Figured this needed to come home," he said, pressing it into her palm. That spring, they started a project neither had planned, restoring the quilt Marcus's grandmother had started 40 years earlier and never finished, squares of fabric from 4 decades of Whitfield clothing folded in a cedar chest, waiting. Odessa brought her needle and thimble, Marcus brought patience and a willingness to learn stitches his rough hands weren't built for. They worked most Sunday evenings on Dolores's porch, old stories drifting out between stitches, this square from Marcus's christening gown, that one from a dress worn to a 1962 church picnic. It took 3 months, evening by evening, thread pulling old pieces into something whole again. There were nights they laughed till Dolores hollered at them to hush, nights Marcus pricked his thumb so often Odessa started keeping a bandage box just for him, nights they hardly talked, just sat in the good quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill silence with proof of anything. Watching those mismatched squares come together into something that could keep a family warm for another 40 years felt like watching their own relationship stitch itself whole in real time. It was an ordinary Tuesday when she said it, no candles, no plan behind it. They were on the porch steps, the finished quilt draped over the rail, drying from its first wash, and Marcus was telling her some meandering story about a truck that wouldn't start, and Odessa found herself just watching his face, easy and unguarded in the porch light, and the words came out before she'd decided to say them. "I love you, Marcus." He didn't fumble it, didn't make it bigger than it needed to be. He just took her hand, steady as he'd been every day since the mint garden, and said, "I love you too. Been loving you a while now. Just been waiting on you to catch up to what I already knew." She laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere old and long and used, and rested her head against his shoulder while the quilt dried in the evening breeze. He proposed in October, on that same terrace where the party had once put Odessa's whole self on display for a crowd that never deserved to judge her. Marcus arranged it quiet, with Bethany's genuine blessing this time, no cruelty left in it. The white lights were strung again, magnolia thick in the cooling air, and when Odessa walked out in a new dress, deep green, stitched over 3 unhurried weeks, Marcus stood exactly where he'd once told her, "You ready?" He didn't kneel with some rehearsed speech. He pulled out a small box, and inside wasn't just a ring, it was her grandmother's thimble, reset into a pendant, resting beside it. "This dress, that thimble, this exact spot," he said, voice thick. "I want you to know, this isn't the place somebody made you smaller. This is the place you decided to let somebody see all of you, and I got to be the man standing next to you for it. Marry me, Odessa." She said yes before he'd finished getting down on one knee, both of them laughing through tears while Dolores whooped from the steps, and the same lights that once lit up a cruel joke lit up, instead, the truest thing either of them had built. Here's what I've come to believe, watching stories like this unfold. Fear makes a convincing case for itself. It'll show you every old wound as proof of what's coming next, and dress up self-protection as wisdom. But love, real love, the steady, showing up every Thursday kind, doesn't ask you to stop being careful. It just asks you, eventually, to stop confusing a good man with the ones who came before him. Somewhere in Magnolia Creek tonight, there's a blue dress in a glass case, and 2 people who learned the test isn't whether someone survives your worst suspicion. It's whether you're brave enough, eventually, to stop testing at all. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. Do you think Odessa was wrong to test Marcus before the party, or was that just hard-earned wisdom talking? And that thimble, was it the perfect symbol of what they built? Drop your thoughts below, I read every one. If you love this story, hit subscribe and share it with somebody who needs reminding good love is still out there. And come back next week. A small-town nurse is about to find out the quiet man fixing her fence every Sunday isn't quite who the whole town thinks he is.